Welcome back to my channel. Just this past week, I was confronted with a particularly good example of a bad tendency in interpreting non-biblical ancient literature. And so, even though I had been planning to move on to make some applications of these lessons about non-biblical literature to the Gospels and examples where I, for example, think there might be a good faith error, I've decided to delay that because this is such a perfect example of why we should not just automatically accept that someone who's a classicist, even a well-respected classicist, is right and just blindly accept his conclusions about some non-biblical literature. This is where my having gotten a PhD in English allows me to say something here, and I imagine that there are those in my audience who have received either undergraduate or graduate degrees in the humanities who can probably say the same from their own perspective. Even when we're not talking about wild postmodernism, references to Derrida and so forth. Even when we're talking about, relatively sober humanities areas and work in these humanities areas, it has been true for many decades that in the humanities there's a tendency to go for what seems to the scholar to be the more exciting hypothesis or the more interesting hypothesis rather than the most probable hypothesis. I even saw this in my own dissertation advisor, for whom I had great respect and affection as a scholar. His area was Spencer, and he was constantly concluding that Spencer was alluding to the Greek fathers of the church. So these would be like those who were back even before Catholicism, before the split between East and West and Greek Orthodoxy and Catholicism. And he would argue this on the basis of what seemed to me to be very insufficient evidence. And he was a very conservative scholar. He was trying to go for what Spencer's intention was, but he was over-interpreting, over-arguing. And I saw this again and again. And it's true in classics as well. So just because somebody is a scholar in a field outside of biblical literature per se and is drawing a conclusion there and is widely respected, you don't say, oh, well, then he must just be right. You have to be willing to look at the reasons. And the humanities, of which classics is one, and New Testament, I think, is a humanities discipline as well, they're just not very rigorous. And you've got to come up with something different, something new to say, something that seems interesting to say. And a lot of bad methodology gets in there, even among the most widely respected scholars. And the example I'm going to talk about today shows classicist Christopher Pelling applying a terrible argument from silence and what I've called all or nothing dependence to go literary on something in Plutarch, and to conclude that Plutarch is making up a scene where the evidence that he's making up a scene is highly insufficient. This was brought to my attention because on Free Thinking Ministries, Dr. Michael Licona was talking about a question that the skeptic Alex O'Connor asked on a different show. So O'Connor asked, I believe it was Dinesh D'Souza, would you at least agree that the gospel authors sometimes, I believe, use the word modified, the facts, the historical facts for a theological agenda? And D'Souza says yes and no, but then when he explains himself, it's clear that he really means no. They may select facts to tell, but it's all historical, is what D'Souza is saying. So then they stop the clip, and Licona is asked, how would you have answered that question? And Dr. Licona basically says, oh, I would have agreed that the gospel authors sometimes modify the facts. And he gives several examples. They're not even necessarily the most striking ones. He doesn't mention John just making up I thirst out of nowhere, which he believes and has reaffirmed recently. And when I say out of nowhere, I mean, supposedly privately thinking of my God, why have you forsaken me, which doesn't sound at all the same. He was privately thinking of that in the theory, but I call that making it up out of nowhere, because that's really unevidenced, and it looks like a completely different saying, and John portrays it as historical. But he gives several examples, such as John changing the day and time of the crucifixion. Let me just clarify something here, and here I don't think Dr. Licona was trying to hide anything. His wording is just a little, I think, accidentally ambiguous. He said, by just a few hours. Well, that just a few hours only applies, in his view, to the time, where he thinks John changed the time. But where he thinks John changed the day of the crucifixion, that's not just a few hours, a day. Okay, like a whole day. So just to clarify that, supposedly to portray Jesus more as the Lamb of God. And he gives various other examples where he thinks that the gospel authors changed some of the facts in their stories, but it doesn't touch the essence of the story. Now, in the lead-in to his giving those gospel examples, he goes into a discussion of a case in Plutarch, where Christopher Pelling says that Plutarch invented a scene. And so Licona uses this as an argument that the gospel authors also felt free to change. So, for example, one of his examples he gives is that Matthew, he thinks, changed the location of the Sermon on the Mount, that it wasn't really on a mountain, and so forth. And so, as I've often said, he's using these classics examples as the kind of ratchet that you with a ratchet, you have a fixed place that it's gotten to, where you say, well, at least this much is what we're doing, and then you push farther. So, at least we supposedly know that the ancient non-biblical authors did this. That's our fixed point, and then we push it farther into the Gospels. And that's what he's doing here. Now, what's interesting is he says that he doesn't know the reasons why Christopher Pelling thinks that Plutarch made up a scene. But he trusts him because he's the foremost Plutarch scholar today. I'm not even sure that that's true. But whatever, he is a well-respected classicist. And it's actually not that hard to chase down Pelling's reasons. Now, Dr. Licona gives a pretty good, setup of the background, that there was a guy named Trebonius who was conspiring to kill Caesar, and that he had sounded out Antony to see if he wanted to join the conspiracy, and Antony didn't want to go so far as to join the conspiracy, but he didn't warn Caesar either. Okay, so that's like a short version of the background here. Now, what we find is that Cicero, the orator, hated Antony. And he has these speeches from which we get history according to Cicero, against Antony. And one of these is known as the Second Philippic. And he's, just railing at Antony. Okay? And then we have the similar incident, and I think it probably is the same incident, told in Plutarch's Life of Antony. Okay, so I'm going to read a little section from Cicero's Second Philippic, and then I'm going to read a little section from Plutarch's Life of Antony. Okay, Second Philippic. This is Cicero addressing and condemning Antony. All right. If it be a crime to have wished that Caesar might be put to death, beware, I pray you, O Antonius, of what must be your own case, as it is notorious that you, when at Narbo, formed a plan of the same sort with Caius Trebonius, and it was on account of your participation in that design that, when Caesar was being killed, we saw you called aside by Trebonius. But I praise you for having once in your life had a righteous intention. I return you thanks for not having revealed the matter, and I excuse you for not having accomplished your purpose. That exploit required a man. Now Cicero should be dripping with sarcasm. He hates Antony. And so he's fake praising him for hiding from Caesar the fact that the people were planning to kill him. Okay? You're so manly. You didn't get involved personally, but you also didn't tell Caesar. All right. Now, in Plutarch's Life of Antony, he's talking about the conspirators and how they were trying to figure out how many people and which people to involve in their conspiracy to kill Caesar. Quote from Plutarch's Life of Antony. This incident, not going to go into what incident, strengthened the party of Brutus and Cassius, these are the conspirators, and when they were taking count of the friends whom they could trust for their enterprise, they raised a question about Antony. The rest were for making him one of them, but Trebonius opposed it, for he said, while people were going out to meet Caesar on his return from Spain, Antony had traveled with him and shared his tent, and he, that is Trebonius, had sounded him, that is Antony, quietly and cautiously. Antony had understood him, he said, but had not responded to his advances. Antony had not, however, reported the conversation to Caesar, but had faithfully kept silence about it. Upon this, the conspirators again took counsel to kill Antony after they had slain Caesar, but Brutus prevented this. All right, so Trebonius says, I had this conversation with Antony when we shared a tent, and, I was like, hey, do you think maybe we should kill Caesar? He's like hinting at that, and Antony understood that's what he was hinting at, but didn't take the bait to actually join in the conspiracy, but faithfully, from their perspective, kept it from Caesar, didn't reveal it. And then these conspirators are so harsh that they even are like, well, if you didn't want to join in, let's kill Antony eventually. And then Brutus is like, no, let's not go that far. Okay, so it's apparently the same incident, but in Plutarch, it's a lot more detailed. It's and it specifically says that Antony didn't want to join in. That's a little bit different from the second Philippic, where it says you formed a plan of the same sort with Caius Trebonius. But that's just a matter of perspective and interpretation. Do you call it, Antony being involved in the plan when he didn't actually, stab Caesar, but keeping quiet about it and agreeing to keep quiet about it, and in that respect aiding the conspirators? Or do you regard it as his, like in an entrapment scheme or something, the person's just like, not taking the bait, but then not warning anybody about it either. All right, so these are compatible. There's no contradiction here. Now, I found the passage where Pelling gives his reasons for thinking that Plutarch basically made up this scene, just inserting into it certain facts that were actual facts, but, in other words, that he had no reason to believe that it was in a tent, that they shared a tent. No idea about Trebonius sounding him cautiously, even. Okay. So, and then also probably inventing the scene where Trebonius is like telling all of this to the conspirators, because that's not in Cicero either. All right, here is Pelling's argument. Finally, Antony 13, that's the passage from the Life of Antony I just read, repays examination. Antony has just failed in his clumsy attempt to crown Caesar at the Lupercalia. That episode strengthened the conspirators' hand, and they considered approaching possible allies. Some suggested inviting Antony, but Trebonius opposed this. He mentioned an earlier occasion on which he had himself sounded Antony. Now, follow what Pelling says. His remarks, again, seem based on the second Philippic 34. That's the Cicero. In Plutarch, the passage is transformed. Antony now shares a tent with Trebonius as his travel companion. Trebonius broaches the subject, and Plutarch stresses what was a very easy inference, that Antony neither joined the plot nor revealed it to Caesar. The details give the anecdote conviction and interest, but they are again not very substantial. They are much more likely to come from Plutarch's imagination than from any independent authority. All right, now this is found. This passage by Pelling is found in a couple different places. It's found in an article, and I can give a link to the journal article reference, but it's also apparently in his book Plutarch and History. All right. Now, Licona is very explicit. He just assumes that Pelling is right and that Plutarch invented this stuff, and he's like, I don't even know Pelling's reasons, but he's this foremost classicist, and so I'm going to follow him. But the passage from Pelling, which gives his argument, this stuff isn't some kind of deep black box out there where you're just like, oh, this is the declaration of the oracle Christopher Pelling. I know not where he has received it from, but I must accept the oracle. If you're a scholar, you're supposed to give your reasons, and Pelling gives his reasons. They're just not very good. Okay, so it's all or nothing dependence, and it's an argument from silence. It's very clear when you read that passage from Pelling. He says that the passage in Plutarch seems based on the passage in Cicero. Now, I've seen this type of argument elsewhere in classics. There's a case about it concerning Coriolanus and Plutarch's Life of Coriolanus, where a different classicist is super explicit. Well, this seems to be based on this source, and so I'm going to assume that was its only source, and so then everything else has to be made up. Very explicit. Okay? And so this is something that classicists do, and that they pick up on. And New Testament scholars do it as well. This type of argument from silence. If you think that Matthew has a passage that's based on Mark, or Matthew has a passage that's based on Q, and you think you know what was in Q, then it's like, so then that's the only thing it's based on. Why? Well, apparently just because we don't have any other source extant that gives additional material such as is found in this case, Plutarch or Matthew, etc. Now, that's a terrible argument. It's a terrible assumption. You know how many ancient documents have not come down to us? They've been destroyed? Things that we even have mentioned in lists, but we don't know what's in them. We can't read them. It would be extremely easy for Plutarch to have a different source that mentions this, that it was in a conversation in a tent, and that Trebonius was sounding him out cautiously, and that Trebonius mentioned this later to the conspirators, okay, especially since Plutarch isn't that far removed in time from the events, as indeed the gospel authors themselves are not far removed in time from the events they're telling. And so that just adds to the probability that if there's a common story in Matthew and Mark, that Mark isn't Matthew's only source, even if it is a source, okay? But this is what Pelling is doing here. It seems based on the second Philippic, and then he just goes, in Plutarch, the passage is transformed, and that the details, he says, are much more likely to come from Plutarch's imagination than from any independent authority. And he gives no other argument for that. Okay, and we see this in New Testament studies. There's a lecture out there where Dr. Licona is talking about the synoptic problem. And he says, and so scholars say that if a story is in Mark as well as in Matthew and Luke, then that they got the story from Mark. Okay? And then we see this applied that, they got the story only from Mark. Okay, so this is something that New Testament scholars are doing. It's also something that classic scholars are doing, and it's wrong. It's wrong. That something B is based on A doesn't mean that B is based on A alone. Okay, but there's this rigid view. I had my series on rigid scholars, that erases Matthew as having additional sources of information. And this is particularly bad if you support, as Dr. Licona supposedly does, traditional authorship of Matthew. He could have been there at many of these events, and he certainly, even if he wasn't personally present at a given event, could have talked to somebody who was present, and probably did, even just one of the other disciples who was called earlier. So there's no reason to take this he had only one source approach to it. Okay? Pelling's bad argument is supporting Pelling's insufficiently evidenced conclusion about Plutarch making up a scene, making up an event, and then Licona's using that to support the idea that this was just accepted, and that, John changed the day of the crucifixion, Matthew moved the location of the Sermon on the Mount, and then those are just examples. There are many, many others in Dr. Licona's work and in other scholars' work as well, where gospel authors are making up sayings, they're crafting scenes and so forth, supposedly, for which they have no historical warrant. There's no good reason to accept that argument. And I strongly urge that you don't let yourself be pulled in by this kind of extreme deference to non-biblical scholarship, to where we say, well, then that must have just been accepted at the time. This must be changed. Then it must be accepted at the time. Then we're going to carry that over to the Gospels. There are multiple stages here. For example, something doesn't need to have been incompatible at all. Harmonization is often legitimate in non-biblical as in biblical history. If there is a discrepancy, it needn't have been deliberate. Good faith error in non-biblical literature just does not get considered often enough, and I've given examples there. And then finally, if a non-biblical author did make something up, if we, were forced to conclude that, as in the case of Josephus that I discussed, or as in the case of Lucian that I discussed, where he's just mocking these people for being credulous, then why not take that to have been propaganda or deception? In fact, to serve the person's purpose, it would need to be in cases where we're conjecturing, that he was trying to hide something, or he was trying to troll somebody or whatever. So all of these are being disregarded. All of these stops along the line are being disregarded in favor of more complex, more literary conclusions that we're going literary, and we're going to say, oh, this was all just accepted at the time, and so on and so on. And it's in this genre where they were expected to do that in places where that's not the best conclusion. So next week, I hope to relate this to a couple of places where I conclude that there are good faith errors in the Gospels. Indeed, I was on the verge of recording that video today when it suddenly hit me. This thing about Trebonius and Pelling is an example I really need to give, because it's a really good example of the application of the argument from silence and all or nothing dependence in non-biblical literature, so that people can see that there isn't as much good authority behind this as you will be told. So please come back next week to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.